Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. And the reason I'm doing this video is that something I saw on the news about 4 days ago has really bothered me. And I won't bury the lead. CTV News, which is a Canadian news channel, was talking about what they report as a rise in threats of violence, and in some cases threats of death, against members of Justin Trudeau's cabinet, the present federal Liberal government. That there's been this sudden spike in threats of either violence or murder against senior members of the Trudeau government, including Trudeau. That somebody tried to break into the residence of the Prime Minister, who was armed apparently, and there was a threat against Catherine McKenna, and there have been threats against Bill Morneau, and there's threats against Jerry Butts, and there seems to be, or at least the news is reporting, that there is this sudden and unprecedented spike in threats of violence against senior members of the Canadian federal government, the Liberal Party. And the CTV News reported this, and I'll show you a clip in a second, with the seeming implication that they had no idea why this was happening. I just couldn't figure it out. Like, why would this be? Like, what's with all these threats of violence? Why would this be happening?
Well, the RCMP are issuing a warning that threats against the Prime Minister and his cabinet are on the rise. These new details come from the Protective Policing Unit. The CBC's Natalie Collada is on this story for us from Toronto. So, hey, Natalie, what kind of threats are we hearing about?
Hannah, what we're hearing about right now are severe threats to the life and person of elected officials in this country. The RCMP data suggests that between January of this year and July of this year, they had 130 threat files that they had to create. If you compare that to the year before, that same time period, there were about 30. So there is a significant jump here.
Absolutely, completely unacceptable for sure. Is there any indication what's behind the threats?
We know last year, the Privy Council, the clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Warnick, talked a little bit about this. He said, and he issued a warning, that political discourse was reaching new lows, leading to leaders, his concern that could end up being assassinated. Take a look at this quote. He said, "The rising tide of incitements to violence, with people using terms like treason and traitor in open discourse, I am worried somebody is going to be shot in this country this year during the political campaign."
I'm so puzzled. Heavens to Murgatroyd, we're scratching our head and we can't figure it out. Why would there be all these threats of violence? Now, to try to answer that question in a comprehensive way, I kind of have to ask another question. Why do you think Western societies have this great, big, gigantic, cumbersome, very expensive, very slow-moving, and not satisfying to anybody institution that they call the legal system or the justice system? And that includes the courts and the judges and the system of lawyers and the schools, the law schools, and the police and the justice institutes where the police are trained, and the municipal police and the federal police and the provincial police and the justice branch of government. It includes all of that. All of it is very expensive to maintain, and nobody who goes through this system as a plaintiff in the civil cases, or as a defendant, or as an accuser in the criminal system, nobody who goes through the courts comes out satisfied. Whether you win or lose, everybody who goes through the legal system comes out bruised and battered and damaged and very unhappy with their experience. Even people who go through and are acquitted of whatever crime they were accused of, they come out damaged and harmed. And the people who go through as a complainant, who making an accusation, I'm a victim of crime and I want so-and-so strung up or locked up or something, those people get chewed up as well. Nobody is happy with it. So why do we maintain this system? And I really mean that everybody is unhappy. I mean, we have the present Black Lives Matter stupidity of demanding that we actually abolish the police, and of course they also mean the courts. And that seems almost beyond comprehension, and it's so unbelievably ridiculously stupid, but I don't want to beat on that drum too much. But it's not actually new, because if you go back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, you have a continuous political push from the left, particularly the feminist left, to eradicate such things as due process, to eradicate the presumption of innocence, to block the inclusion of exculpatory evidence for the accused. And on the other side, you have on the anti-feminist activist side, you have people demanding that false accusations, actually fraudulently made accusations, that then utilize the courts and the police to enact violence on people for political reasons unrelated to the subject of a phony, spurious accusation, that the penalties for those need to be, number one, actually there needs to be penalties, but number two, that should be some multiple of the prospective penalty of a person falsely accused. And again, everybody is unhappy with how the court system works in both directions. So why do we have it? Why do we spend so much money? We have so much energy, we have so much of our public resources going into maintaining the courts and the judges and the lawyers and the legal schools and the police academies and all that stuff in the prison system and everything. Like, why is it so important that we have this thing, this grand apparatus that makes nobody very happy, that we call the rule of law? Why does it matter so much? And I say that it does matter. I think it really matters a great deal. And why do we have the courts? You might say, well, it's because we want to stop crime or punish criminals or deter crime. That's a reasonable answer, but I think it's wrong. And you might think maybe we have all this to protect victims or to assuage the pain of victims or something like that. And that's also a reasonable answer, but again, I think it's wrong. I think the real answer is actually simpler and more brutal than any of these, like protect victims or stop crime. Why do we have this grand, formal, procedural, slow-moving, and not satisfying to anybody system that we maintain at great expense? The answer is, when we have a serious grievance, something grave enough, something serious enough that we would think to go through the courts, if we had a society that didn't have the rule of law, that didn't have the police and the courts and the jails and the lawyers and the judges, if we didn't have any of that, we would still be finding ways to resolve our grievances, but we would be doing it by basically acting directly against the people who had offended us. We'd be killing one another. And that killing wouldn't end with one person who was aggrieved just killing the other person and okay, that's done. Then the friends and family of the person who was the original offender or was the original accused offender, who then got killed by their supposed victim, then the family or the friends would then engage in vendetta violence against the first person or their family or their survivors, and you get a cycle. You get a cycle of revenge violence, which escalates into tribal war. And I have seen tribal wars which are multiple generations long in countries that don't have a tradition of the English system of common law in the courts. They don't have a tradition of the rule of law. And they resolve grievances by tribal war, or they resolve grievances by direct violence, which leads to cycles of tribal war. And then people are being killed weekend after weekend in these skirmishes over somebody's great-great-great-grandfather stole 2 goats from somebody else's great-great-great-grandfather 2 villages over the hill. Now that's all fine and cute and quaint when the only people getting killed are a couple of villages living in the back bush of Highland Papua New Guinea. We are a modern technological society and we live in big cities and we have access to modern weaponry. If we stop having our system of law, the system of courts and justice and police and lawyers and this formal, slow-moving and not satisfying to anybody process of resolving our grievances through the police and courts, if we just go back to resolving our grievance by direct action, it's going to be much more bloody, much more brutal, and induce much more carnage in our society than anybody can possibly imagine. Your imagination cannot begin to fathom how bad it's going to be. And that's why the rule of law and the apparatus through which the rule of law operates, which is our courts, really, really matters. Now, this is a long way around the fucking mulberry bush to get to a point that I wanted to make. Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. CTV News has said that the Trudeau cabinet, his senior members of cabinet, have been facing increasing levels of threats of violence and attempts at violence. Somebody tried to break into the Prime Minister's residence, into the grounds, and the police intervened. And there was threats against Catherine McKenna, there's been threats against Bill Morneau, there's threats against Jerry Butts, there's threats against all these, Chrystia Freeland. Well, why is that? Well, Trudeau's government, even the present opposition in Parliament, has called Trudeau's government a kleptocracy.
There's a name for what we have right now, and there's a name for a government like Justin Trudeau's, a government run by those who seek status and personal gain at the expense of the rest of us. It's called a kleptocracy. Now, I looked it up in the dictionary, and it comes from the Greek origin thief, I steal, and power rule. Is a government whose corrupt leaders, kleptocrats, use political power to appropriate the wealth of their nation, typically by embezzling or misappropriating government funds at the expense of a wider population. Now, in a kleptocracy, corrupt politicians enrich themselves secretly outside the rule of law through kickbacks, bribes, and special favors, or they simply direct state funds to themselves directly or indirectly and their associates. Now, we've had $343 billion in deficits, $1.2 trillion in debt, and that gives a government a lot of room to misappropriate that wealth, or in the case of the debt of our nation, to direct those state funds to themselves or their associates. And there's a reason why these scandals are profoundly scandalous, Mr. Speaker.
We have a government which has scandal after scandal after scandal. Trudeau's been found guilty 3 times, I believe, at this point, of serious ethics violations, and those are just the things that he's been charged and found guilty for. There are literally dozens and dozens of grotesque, overt moral violations by Trudeau, and it seems that there's no consequence. So again, where there is no formal consequence, that is to say, where there is no rule of law, which there doesn't seem to be any rule of law for Trudeau. It seems to be able to just skate out from under one criminal action after another. And I say not just ethical, criminal. We have a bandit running our country. He is looting. He's looting and stealing and violating the law willy-nilly. He's a bandit. He's a thief. We have a kleptocracy running Canada. It is the most corrupt government I think I've ever seen in the Western world. And the public, it's not just me, I hate Justin. The public are increasingly calling for, some form of impeachment, some form of charge for treason, that he should not just be fired from his role as Prime Minister or resign. People call for him to resign, but that's what a moral and ethical person in that office would do to demonstrate that they actually have a moral compass. So it's kind of silly to ask for him to resign. But people want to see him charged with crimes because he's committing crimes. Interfering with the Justice Minister, stealing, bribery, giving no-bid contracts to friends of the family who then pay his family off. Like, the list of offenses seems to be endless. And yet there's no serious consequence. Well, this is the general public. This is the public of Canada waking up to the fact that the rule of law in Canada seems to no longer be in operation. And where there is no formal way to resolve this grievance, people will find an improvised way, which is direct violence. That's why the rule of law bloody matters. Because where it doesn't exist, people will find a way that is direct instead of this formal, slow, dissatisfying way. I would much rather have this be going to the courts, that he be charged with the crime, there be investigation, maybe he's even found innocent. Because without that, without the perception of there being an actual system of justice, an actual formal method that the rule of law is actually observed, we're going to see nothing except more and more devolvement to the way a society without the rule of law solves these problems, which eventually is, in the case of a corrupt kleptocracy, will be something like regicide. Anyway, you might guess why I was very reluctant to talk about this. This is by no way an endorsement of any of this violence. I would much rather see some kind of restoration of the actual function of the court system, the function of the police, the RCMP. Come on, guys, do your jobs, please. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and as always, have a lovely, lovely day.